The Duchess of Devonshire said, Derek, can you do anything with all these barns we've got across our fields? Because they're falling down and none of the tenant farmers want to use them for any reason now. And I'm thinking, wouldn't it be good if they could be used for people to stay in some way? So we thought, well, okay, let's see what we can do. And the Duchess was keen that they were kept very much as they were, not altered, with the idea that people might camp in them. But we had to get permission to do that. So we approached the local authority and they said, well, you know, if you're going to have people staying in them, they'll need heating, they need insulation, they need water supply, drainage, all this sort of thing, all of which was clearly impossible and would have completely transformed the barns. And these were not barns next to a farmhouse. These were absolutely in the middle of a field barn. So then we had to think separately about it. And so I tried to approach the camping association, and then the caravan association, and then the scouts and the guides. And the guides eventually said, yes, they might be able to use them as a sort of camp. But then again, we had to get permission for that. And in order to do that, we came up with the concept of having, instead of a canvas tent, a stone tent. So the stone barn will be the tent. And before the people got there, it was just an empty stone barn. And when the people were there, they pitched camp and the stone tent could be used. And then when they broke camp and left, the tent was sort of left unused. But quietly inside, there was a wooden bench for up to half a dozen people to sleep on, and one bench instead of sleeping on the floor in their sleeping bag, just as you would in a tent. There was a stone higher bench at one end in which there was simply a washing up bowl. Outside there was a water tap that you could go to and get your water, and in the corner of the field there was a sort of temporary loo. So this was, then we called them stone tents. But the problem was the legislation at the time didn't acknowledge stone tents. So we had to go to get special dispensation, and the special dispensation, which the Chief Executive of Derbyshire District Councils was very good at supporting, I believe after a phone call from the Duchess, then put it forward, and it was debated in Parliament, and the Camping and Caravan Acts were amended to include reference to stone tents.
I was able to, at weekends, to kind of engage in and organise kind of working parties on some of those sites that we were dealing with, especially the biggest of the stone tents, and work on the fitting out of the interiors. So it involved kind of going to the Chatsworth building yard and getting salvage materials delivered to the site, and then doing things like cutting and laying the stone flags and building the stone platforms. Watching the estate joiners doing some of the fitting out of the wooden platforms that Derek spoke about. We didn't get involved in the plumbing. But also, on one of the projects, there was a big stone slating repair needed. The stone slate coverings of the roof needed to be removed and stacked, and kind of got ready for one of the local slating firms, Sellers of Bakewell, who had worked for many generations for the Chatsworth estate. And so there were working weekends. Sometimes we could take our children along. It was, and get other members of the trust involved in doing kind of, you know, the clearing and the groundwork for the kind of the building specialists to come along and do their work afterwards. And at the end of the project, when all 3 buildings had been completed, there was an opening ceremony at the barns, attended by the Duchess and her dogs, She'd obviously kind of walked across for the event, but was very much a side player. She just kept out of the way and watched everything happening. She'd been very good in organising kind of regular meetings at Chatsworth to kind of plan and check the progress of the project. And like Derek, we'd had interesting times sat around a table in some part of the private quarters at Chatsworth, having kind of tea and biscuits. And the teas, I remember being served by an aged butler who staggered around the table with two enormous brown china teapots saying, Indian or China, sir. Had this I didn't really know which to choose. You know, I was a PG Tips man myself, but it was fascinating. But she turned up at the opening ceremony, which was attended by the great and the good from the guiding world. It was a very kind of jolly affair. We had, you know, we were thanked by the Guiding Association people for what we'd done, and Clive Reid and myself were presented with silver badges, which were we were made honorary guides as a result of our works for the on the project, which was nice. And then the Duchess had arranged for a kind of a celebration dinner in one of the dining rooms of the house, and her chef had prepared a lovely meal. We were all invited to attend after the opening ceremony. It was a very kind of lavish affair. Our children, who accompanied us, were present, and as the meal progressed, and there was a lot of fine wine as well as fine food, and so as the meal progressed, the children got obviously more bored than we were, and so the Duchess said they could go next door and kind of play out of the kind of the reach of the alcohol and the food and the tables and so on, and allow the adults to carry on. And when we went to fetch the children at the end of the meal, walked through into this part of the house, which was one of the grand rooms of the house, absolutely stuffed with fantastic and fantastically expensive portraiture, glass, china, and all of the other wonderful things that Chatsworth's full of. And I remember feeling my blood running cold at the thought of my children and the other children that were present actually kind of rampaging through there, touching or damaging or poking at any of the kind of the portraits that were standing at ground level. There was no damage done, thank goodness, but it was an example of just how kind of relaxed and welcoming the Duchess was to our children, as well as being incredibly supportive for the efforts that the adults had made on what was a very enjoyable and I think worthwhile stone tents project.
But about that time, things went a bit difficult for the Trust, and indeed all sorts of things changed. Trustees were getting older, less able to be energetic. Alan Benrose, I think, had succeeded from being chairman and taken over by somebody else. I can't remember now who exactly it was. Things went very quiet. The Trust almost became moribund. It became a talking shop. We weren't taking on any buildings, partly to do with lack of funding from central government in any form, whether it was English heritage in its day prior to the change to Historic England. But then the advent of the lottery. And with the success of Wingfield Station, we can all say that the lottery is the only show in town that is really worth going to for grant aid for these projects. Very, very different from the 80s and 90s, when the smaller projects the Trust took on were largely funded by money from English heritage.
That's right, yeah.
And the local authorities in some cases.
Yeah.
It's all changed, so we've gone downhill and we've come back up, and we're now in the ascendancy, as they might say.
Yeah. some of the smaller projects, such as the ones that I got involved with in Eckington and in Barlborough, were very, very much the product of that time, where we could, propose something, knowing and having the confidence to know that we were going to be supported by both the local authority and English Heritage funding. The project I was involved with in Eckington, for instance, was the restoration of a kind of a modest terrace of housing in the heart of the kind of the village, the old village centre, in the heart of the conservation area. And it was a spin-off project, if you like, from the much bigger project in Wirksworth, the Wirksworth project, which Barry and kind of had a deep involvement with it, and Anthony Rossi, who was one of Allan's predecessors as the Historic Buildings Advisor in the team. My small project in Eckington actually involved the Duchess again, who was the person who came to celebrate its opening, and there was a kind of amusing scene in the car park behind those buildings, where the Duchess and Alan Bemrose had come to kind of celebrate the opening, the official opening ceremony. There was quite a small crowd of people initially at that opening, but when word got round in the village centre that the Duchess was going to be the person opening it, the crowd increased quite substantially, and a very simple opening. But I think another example of how her role as a supporter and focal point for the Trust's activities at that time was so influential. Again, a very, very kind of positive outcome for something rather like the stone tents, a kind of very modest project, but something which is immensely worthwhile for the location in which those buildings.
A lovely lady, but by all accounts, a real human person who loved everybody.